for joining us here this evening. Welcome to our second event of Forging Futures here at the DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church. Forging Futures is a creation of our Reverend Mandy Huizinga, our Director of Religious Education, Steve Cooper, our Director of Membership and Engagement, Tina Lewis, and myself. Forging Futures can be thought of as a speakers bureau, speakers series. We created it with the idea of strengthening, deepening our members' commitment to our religion. But it did not take long for us to realize we had messages that also could appeal to non-members. The original idea was to invite distinguished Unitarian Universalists who would talk to us about, well, one, how our seminaries create Unitarian Universalist ministers, or two, how, in the opinion of the speakers, the Unitarian Universalist religion should evolve, what should we do in this world, and what should we be known for. And upon further reflection, let's invite Unitarian Universalists who are already doing something unique and maybe something unexpected in this world, and hear about their challenges as Unitarian Universalist ministers or just Unitarian Universalists. For this goal, stay tuned for our plans for Veterans Day weekend. And we also came quickly to the conclusion that as a religion uniquely open to the ideas of big thinkers who are not Unitarian Universalists but are tackling tough issues right now that fit our values, we would benefit from hearing from them. And this idea led quickly to our invitation to Dr. Kate Ott, PhD, to speak to us tonight. And for the official introduction of our guest speaker, I turn to Reverend Mandy. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to do the introduction for Dr. Kate Ott. Kate is a feminist social ethicist with specializations in technology, sexuality, race, racism, youth and young adults, pedagogy, and professional ethics. She is the Jerry and Mary Joy Stead Professor of Social Ethics at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, where she serves as the director of the Stead Center for Ethics and Values. She is the co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. Her books include Sex, Tech, and Faith, Christian Ethics for a Digital Society, and Sex Plus Faith, Talking to Your Child from Birth to Adolescence. That's her official introduction. On a more personal note, I actually met Kate in 2011 when I was walking my children through Drew University's campus and came across Kate and Elias, both supposed to be at faculty orientation for new professors, except they were kicked out of the building because of an earthquake in New Jersey. And from then on, we confused everybody because everybody thought Kate was me and I was Kate, and so Kate's students would ask her about her kids, which she does have kids, they just weren't ever on campus, and their students would ask me about assignments. We also confused the heck out of my second child, who thought that Kate's kids were their cousins. So we have lots of connections, and I am delighted, including the fact that you served as my professor for 2 of my classes in seminary when you were still at Drew. I am delighted to have Kate here, and her knowledge around youth, young adult ministry, tech, and sex ed is something that we are desperately in the need of in this particular moment in time. And so I am so grateful that you are here to share your wisdom with us tonight. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you all for welcoming me here today. Neil, Pat, thank you for sharing a meal. Mandy and Elias, it's so good to be here with you. And maybe some of you do recognize my face. I did worship here last spring, one Sunday. Just don't worry, you don't have to remember me. So this is one of my most favorite topics. not just from an academic perspective, but from the lived reality of what's going on in our world and the kinds of amazing conversations I get to have with youth and young adults throughout my semester. Sometimes it's young adults who are in our seminary, but most often it's folks I get to meet at campus ministries, at youth groups that I go and speak to, or at congregations like yours. So, what I try to do whenever I embark on a new opportunity to have this conversation is to place myself in the shoes of young people today. Because it's really easy for me to say, oh, 20 years ago, or my own 40 years ago, right? But it's not the same. So before I say anything about them, about youth, or to you all as trusted adults who walk with them, I want us to think a bit about what their lives are like today. Climate catastrophe brings new challenges to different parts of the US and the globe on a daily basis. Researchers document the rise in climate change anxiety among young people and the daily stress that this can cause. It's often an ambient stress, but it peaks at mundane moments over a decision like whether to recycle the bottle you just used, or if the place you're in allows you to recycle it, or a sudden news blast on your phone about some strange storm that's either forecasted or devastated a new area. They are pandemic survivors, thrown into and out of isolation at socially, emotionally, and educationally formative times in their lives. Gun violence or firearms are the leading cause of death for these children. There's a lot to be anxious about in the daily lives and the futures of our youth. But that's not all that's unique to them. Current teens and 20-somethings are the very first generation to be completely digitally immersed. So before we dismiss this, by perhaps remarking on their dependency of digital devices and rolling our eyes, we should actually question how adults, businesses, governments, schools, and parents make digital existence a prerequisite of participation. I'll make this point again later, but young people are digitally immersed. They are not necessarily digitally savvy. This generation is also the most racially and ethnically diverse group in the United States, and they live in an increasingly and explicitly racially polarized social and political landscape. In the face of this, young people tend to be more politically engaged than past generations, though not in traditional measurements like voting, because most of them can't even vote yet. They have protested or been influenced by adults who publicly protest. Large majorities have organized through digital means for gun reform and queer inclusion by targeting corporations rather than government offices. They are reportedly more socially conscious and social justice oriented than any previous generation along these measures. They're also less religiously affiliated, and yet very spirituality minded. As you know, you as Gen Zers are now, based on Pew Research and Springtide, the largest religiously unaffiliated or most likely to early disaffiliate. So maybe they grew up in a faith tradition, but they're more likely to leave it quicker. Often, they identify still as religious or as spiritual in their personal beliefs, rather than their corporate affiliation. What some are now calling faith unbundled. So why is this? Research shows that they have less confidence in institutions, generally, and are more likely to disaffiliate from institutions that don't support their social justice beliefs. So that would make sense why perhaps lots of young people are leaving conservative traditions if it doesn't match up with those social justice beliefs I just named. So why are they also leaving liberal and progressive faith communities? Well, it could just be the mistrust of institutions generally, but it might also be a different brand of hypocrisy, albeit different from conservative religious experiences. When any faith community, no matter where it falls on the spectrum of social justice or politics, believes it has the only way forward and comes together with a sort of smug confidence that reduces how often they self-evaluate or question their own approach, current youth and young adults are likely to find that intolerable. Even in the face of fraying social fabric, climate weirdness, and everyday threats to health and wellness, these young people care about social justice. They care about spirituality. Or maybe it's because of these things that they care. They do so while seeking spiritual grounding from a bundle of mixed faith resources. Now, both of these points should be very good news for a UU audience, right? The UU values allow for grounding, and the covenant statements guide actions. Striving to be a place that enfleshes those is something young people say they want to be part of. So given these factors, what's an effective posture and purpose for how we can approach walking with youth today? We might conclude from what I've said that, hey, the kids will be all right. And honestly, I think for the most part, it's true. But it's not the whole story. Contributing to the shape of how young people live their ethics requires a certain posture and purpose from adults to support them. The postures shown to have the greatest impact on youth and young adult flourishing, and these are I'm taking tons of research and making my own language for it, all right? Radical hospitality, intergenerational invitation, and sustained real relationships. And when I say real, that doesn't mean non-digital. I'm going to describe real in a moment for you. It doesn't mean offline or online. So, radical hospitality. Y'all are probably used to saying things like, everyone is welcome. Affirmation and acceptance are key to youth flourishing. But that does not mean anything goes. Often repeated in my education classes to young folks is the phrase, all people are welcome, not all behaviors are tolerated. So welcoming does not mean there are not shared values and ethics as part of our gathering. Radical hospitality is about presence and space. It is not free of accountability for oneself or others. That's true in any community, whether it's family, a classroom, a sports team, or a religious youth group. Generational invitation. Faith communities are now the only place in the United States beyond the family that is intergenerational. And sometimes even our families aren't intergenerational. We segment up the lives of children and youth to age, ability, and interest-driven activities. Some of your children, if they don't have siblings, might not even interact with kids outside of their own age groups. It's through diverse communities that hold all kinds of differences, but including and especially age differences, where young people understand pasts and futures. As one of my colleagues often says, we can't learn to be good ancestors, which is his definition of ethical living, if we don't interact with those who are living and learn the stories of those who have gone before. This also means we need to be who we are at our various age stages. Kids should be kids. Parents, parents. Youth leaders and teachers should be leaders and teachers. We don't need to be peers or friends to the young people we love and serve. They need us to be trusted adults first and foremost. So what does that look like in real relationships. Presence is often most important. Literally just being there. Participate, listen, reduce your own distractions when you're with them. But it may also mean, if they allow, showing up on their social media feeds, seeing what they've posted, liking it, maybe talking about it. I can tell you there were many a dinner conversations where I knew something happened to one of their friends before they knew it, because they hadn't even had the chance to look at their feed. But it had popped up in mine, and I knew one of their friends had X accomplishment or went on vacation here. It created a networked sense of being present in their lives. A posture of real relationships means we let go of perfection, even as adults. We all grow, change, and make mistakes. All of us spend too much time curating our lives rather than living them. This posture reverses that trend. It may mean you also have to let go of documenting everything as an example for them. Right? Vacations happen even if you don't post photos of them. Concerts can still be moving if you haven't taken a video of it. It's okay to do both, but it's also okay just not to do that other digital part either, as an example. So I hope you can already see how these three postures are a strong foundation for healthy sexuality and digital well-being. Accountability paired with affirmation as radical hospitality. Awareness of and respect for intergenerational differences as an intergenerational invitation. And relationships grounded in communication, presence, and honesty as real relationships. So that was posture. What of purpose? Well, with those postures in place, or at least working toward them, what's the purpose of a religious community and faith in the lives of young people? Many religious educators, moral development theorists, and adolescent well-being specialists will name the following in various ways, and I'm going to simplify it to three responsibilities or a threefold purpose. Information. It's actually simple. And yet, we don't have reliable sources of information around anymore. It takes a lot to discern whether information is good or bad, or maybe just not even real. Being a positive source of information means you are a resource for young people, and they will continue to come to you. We directly impact their social, emotional, and educational formation, as well as their moral formation. Or said another way, how they live fully into who they know themselves to be and identify what motivates their actions. This often happens more through our own actions and daily practices, the environments we create for them, than what we say. So you're going to hear this a lot tonight. Say all you like about how people should behave or what they should do. Until you also start doing it, it will not have an impact on children's behavior or youth development. They learn more from what you do than what you say. In some cases, we make or break young people's ability to participate in and witness transformation through how our faith communities are shaped. Of course, as they get older and have more freedom of movement, they can access other forms of information, they can tap into peers, they can find new communities. But kids who learn how to make a difference to others in small and big ways are often the most resilient when faced with difficulties. They know the world's bigger than them, and so they can face the difficulties that come at them. And they also know that someone else will lean in and help them because they have also done that. One of the facts that I always think surprises people when I'm talking to parents specifically about sexuality education and healthy decisions is that honestly, having a kid who goes out and helps people is one factor in reducing negative sexual health outcomes. Right? So you think, like, encouraging my kid to like go do social service and like social justice programs, that's gonna help? Yes. They learn to care about themselves, about others. They learn respect, dignity. They're busy, right? There's a number of factors that go into reducing any kind of negative outcomes. They also, in those kinds of programs, tend to learn how to communicate with strangers. And communication is a key factor in sexual health. And it's something we have to practice all the time. And it doesn't always have to be talking about sexuality issues. It's just literally learning to communicate and communicate well. So if we think about information, formation, and transformation as the purpose of what we're doing with young people, what does that look like when we think about sexuality and gender? So I'll do this around sexuality and gender, and then I'll do it with regard to social media and digital technology. The example I'll use when we get to digital technology overlaps them. It's hard for me to pull them apart since that's what I talk about most. But I promise there are some examples where I pull them apart. All right, so let's think about the aspects of information when it comes to specifically education around sexuality and gender and inclusion. Faith unbundled might seem like a slippery ethical slope, or it might in fact be the opposite. Remember, young people pick and choose their spiritual practices because they are also reworking a moral system. They are looking for religious traditions and communities that will not prove hypocritical, but instead will offer them space for that questioning. So again, the UU is a great example of this, right? The foundation of the UU values is exactly what they need to start with. Provide guiding values without dictating specific practices or beliefs in a particular tradition. They need to actually wrestle with it to make it their own. So Faith Unbundled does not mean a lack of values. Rather, it's a move to align values with spirituality and faith beliefs. When it comes to ethical living and sexuality or technology or the overlap, young people have to have those opportunities to own their own values. Trusted adults should be clear about the values of their faith tradition. So when I say questioning the values, I don't mean say, oh, these aren't our values. Or, I mean, you could take a few and leave the rest. No, they actually want to know why you're convicted about these values. They want to know how you wrestle with putting them into action. The idea of being able to take this shared information and think about the reasoning behind it is the whole process they're longing for. So don't just tell them the what of your tradition, but tell them the why. And then as you think about the way in which the covenants come out of the values, how do you live up to those things that you say we covenant to do? Where do you fall short? How are you working on it, right? Be realistic about it. Don't pretend that everything is easy and fine. Similarly, we can't expect people to act for their best health and well-being without basic information. Young people need information about how their body works, what's expected during puberty, how society shapes our understanding of beauty and gender, and what social privileges come in the wake of those dynamics. OWL, a curriculum you all are going to be using here, right? It does both those. It doesn't just give factual biological information, but it's always pairing it with social analysis and emotional intelligence as part of that education. That is what young people need. So how does that impact formation? When we own our own values, it is more likely that we act in ways that reflect those values. So if I were to say to you, my tradition teaches, it's less likely I'm going to act on those values. But if I were to say to you, I believe this is important, I'm going to act based on those values. I have to own it. So the first thing we need to do to start getting into that pattern, that ethical habit, is to practice communication. When it comes to sexuality, what are some things they can practice? How would you tell someone you like them? How do you talk about sexual health issues with a healthcare provider? How do you ask for consent? This has to be practiced. It doesn't always have to be high stakes, however. You shouldn't actually practice it in the moment that you're really trying to live it out, right? The amount of anxiety that comes with trying to tell someone you like them is not the first time you should try to figure out what's the best way to communicate that. So things like OWL allow the kids to practice those types of conversations. But you can also do this in other settings that share the same message. So I've already said, in addition to being a professor, I've been a religious education teacher for many, many years, from the kindergartners all the way through the high schoolers. For multiple years, I had the 7th and 8th graders, mostly because nobody else wanted them. I thought they were the best kids in the whole congregation. I had one particular group that was predominantly male-identified kids. And when we would go from our larger meeting to our age-specific youth room, they would charge, knocking people out of the way. We had also redesigned our room because the other rooms felt more like classrooms. They did a lot of arts and crafts and things, which is great for younger kids. We redesigned ours to have bean bags and couches and whatever else other folks in church would donate to us, sometimes good, sometimes not. Well, we had a particular double-person beanbag that was the coveted spot. All of these boys would run, charge into the room, and try to be the first 2 to make it to the beanbag. Of course, no matter who the first 2 were, everyone else would pile on top of them. It was funny, they laughed, right? I started to get, worried about safety. And a couple of times there would be some reactions, right? Someone would push someone, get off me, you're not supposed to be on me. And there would be a little skirmish as part of it, and then everything would settle down. So after a couple of weeks of this, I thought, actually this behavior is not living out the values we've set forward for this class at all. It's fun. And I wanted them to have fun, so I had sort of let it go. But in fact, they didn't actually care about the bodies of their fellow youth group members. They were actually hurting and harming each other sometimes. They weren't respecting consent. And they certainly weren't making a welcoming space for the non-binary and female-identified members of the group because they were so loud and had sort of taken over with their physical form in this space. So they do it again, and I call a timeout, and I say, I just want to hear how everybody feels about what's going on here, right? So then we get some of this is fun, don't tell us we can't do it. We get some other people who are like, I kind of feel left out, I never get to be a part of it, Say, okay, tell me what values you all are living out by doing this practice every time we come in this room. So they got around to community, we all love being here with each other. All right, great. I love that. And how does everybody feel about that community? Is this including everyone? Does everyone feel safe? Have we practiced the kinds of things like consent? Beginning in our religious ed very early on, we have rules about you can't touch another person without asking them, you can't share information from another person without getting their permission. We want to teach them early on these values of privacy, accountability, autonomy, consent. And none of it has to do with sexuality. But I really, really hope that when these 7th and 8th grade boys heard me say, when you don't care about someone else's body or their physical space, and you assume that because it's fun, you can go ahead and do what you want, that says to me that in the long-term lives you are going to lead, the kind of relationships you have, may mean you don't respect the bodies and consent of other people. And literally everyone in the room stopped. I was like, Dr. Kate, that's not what we meant at all, right? But all it took was just shifting the way they saw it and letting them know that even when it's your friends and you're jumping on a beanbag, there are some values you want to live out to create healthy relationships. So again, the practices we're doing don't always have to be high stakes around specific sexuality issues. It can be a very easy lesson about how many people fit on a beanbag and how you have to ask for consent before you jump on somebody. All right, so that's a modeling of relationships. Practice equips us and modeling teaches us. With regard to ethical living, we're more likely to follow actions than we are teachings, rules, words that people say to us. So what relationship models do kids see in their lives? Do we use mass media to talk about the relationships we see there? Offer some comments or critiques on them? What about their friendships? Friendships are the first foundation for other kinds of more romantic or sexual relationships that they will have. Or your own relationships at home, the relationships they see in your faith community. The more diverse kids see people interacting with one another, loving each other, creating families in different ways, the more those possibilities open up for them. Sexuality and gender experiences are complex and messy, and we will make mistakes, so it doesn't mean those always have to be positive examples. But if a negative example happens or they notice something negative, talk through it. Don't just let them figure out where they're categorizing it with regard to the values you're trying to share with them. We need to be gentle with ourselves and others because we will make mistakes. But talking about what we think about those relationships is a perfect opportunity to not just let the modeling happen, but to connect it to our values. Over the course of time, that is how transformation happens with regard to ethical living. It's a process, not a destination. It requires, as you've heard time and again, all of these trusted adults who are participating in these conversations. Youth leaders, parents, the people who just run into someone in the hallway who are part of your faith community. But it also requires diverse models of sexual health and gender well-being, where kids can find spaces where they see themselves and other possibilities reflected for them. It also means that we have to admit we don't know what all those possibilities are yet. They have changed radically in the last 50 years, or the public quality of them has changed radically in 50 years. So how do we continue to welcome that in ways that we can connect our values to? And lastly, that's going to mean we have to have a lot of conversations about new relational standards. I find even in some of the most progressive faith communities that I go to, people still struggle with, what's the sexual ethic I'm supposed to say to young people? Right? So we default to things that maybe we don't even believe in, like you shouldn't engage in certain sexual behaviors until you're married. Well, I would guess your values don't actually support that. They might support waiting for other reasons, but not because of some sort of political, governmental, or even religious ritual of marriage. We might talk about specific relationship configurations, like it just has to be these people for this amount of time and then it's okay. Are we sure? Does that reflect the practices and values of people in this faith community? Maybe not. So then what do we tell them? What are our new relational standards to help them as guides? You can't leave them with nothing, just like you can't say, well, my faith is great, I love it, but not tell them why. So the values, how do you put the values into practice? Almost every youth group I go to, at least a couple of the young people are so excited because they've seen something I've said online, and they think I'm gonna say it's okay for them to do whatever they want, as long as they maybe get consent and have thought about it and had a good communicative conversation. And then I work with them on a list of values similar to the list of values you all have. And I say, okay, actually, I think I would say a good, healthy relationship embodies all these values or is working towards them. And a couple people sigh. And I say, well, what's wrong? Well, that's a lot harder to do. Like, you want us to have like honesty and mutual respect and like communicate with each other, and like that takes a lot of time. Yep. But they leave with a solid core of values that they see in their friendships, that they really value in their friendships, and they can say, I'm worth that in their other relationships too. So we need to help young people articulate what those new relational standards are. And you might think about, how do those reflect your UU values? All right, let's think about digital literacy. I'm probably behind time because of the storytelling. Yeah, Mandy, give me a... Okay, I'm good. All right. So, information. I already said the piece on faith values. We're going to do that same thing with faith values. Very clear about them, why they're important to us. Let them wrestle with it. Let's put it into conversation with digital literacy then. Just like there's a need for sexuality and gender literacy, there's also a need for digital literacy to engage in ethical living. We need to know the basics of how things work. How is the tech actually shaping us? How are we shaping it? Otherwise, there's no hope for us to push back or contribute to more ethical design and development. Now, I could spend a whole another hour just talking about tech design and development and how it already has values embedded. That's a different talk. Pieces of it will come into this. But I'm going to do that horrible thing and say, you can buy the book. We don't have time to only spend on that. So I'm going to give you some examples of the ways in which using particular kinds of tech, knowing how it's designed and what its purpose is, allows young people to kind of negotiate its use, and where perhaps we need to think more about that. So the example I'm going to use to bring sexuality and technology together is around sexting. So that's sending a nude or semi-nude photo or sexually explicit language to someone via a direct message. And I say direct message because there's so many apps that they can be sending this on with regard to direct messages. So why does this happen? You know, maybe many of you are sitting there thinking, I would never send something like that. Why do they do this? Well, remember that the majority of their relationships either start or are maintained and or end through digital means. So where you might have slipped a note into someone's locker, they're sending a direct message. It's a form of a gift economy in relationship building. So all of you who have ever been in a relationship should know this, right? You can give someone else a gift. You can give them a concrete gift. You can take them out to dinner. You can engage in a sexual behavior that they find especially pleasurable as a gift to them, right? So sexting is a form of gift economy in relationship building. I give you something to show you how much I like you and hope for your response that elicits a similar kind of desire. Now, the whole practice is gendered and classed and raced in the same ways and ableist that we judge people's beauty and suitability offline. So I'm not trying to pretend those things aren't part of the mix, and young people definitely don't pretend that. They know all about all those factors in how this is functioning. A digital assumption that many folks participating in sexting might have is that this will be private because it's a direct message. I mean, that's the intention of the mechanism. If I send a single message to one person, that it will remain private. But this is clearly not true based on the technology. Right? Unless one is choosing to use an end-to-end encryption service that auto-deletes the photos on both phones in a very short period of time, and all cloud backups, there's a high possibility that this photo can get distributed, shared, saved, right? But those systems do exist. It's mostly 30 and 40-year-olds who use those systems, just to let you know. They got savvier. Young people still tend to use whatever the primary platform is that they're on for a direct message. So I want to share with you an example from a heterosexual context, a study done of teen girls in a London suburb, mostly working class girls in this teen suburb, predominantly white. They navigated the gender and relational inequality and the privacy issues of sexting in their own manner. So, they took sexting photos of themselves and they shared them purposefully with their girlfriends. They created a semi-private, empowering network of other girls who helped them pick the best photo. They created values around, like, what was the best way to send one? How would you think about it? They basically created an ethic of sexting for this small group to which they all abided. They kept each other's photos. They also helped each other discern when to send one, when not to send one, when to take a next step in the relationship. So we might not approve of this response, but it shows all the aspects of formation that I talked about. And it brings together digital literacy and shared values. So thinking about weighing the norm and its emotional power when it comes to digital technology and ethics, the girls recognized they were in a system that already had norms, and those norms were unfair to them. If you did not send a nude photo to a boy who said that he liked you, you were immediately dropped. So, they created a different system to deal with this. Either they would all agree to not send a photo to that person because none of them were going to be with him, or they would make sure that if they sent a photo, that it was something they were proud of and that all of their friends had already affirmed and loved. They worked to reclaim their own power. They knew the normative ways this was working, both through the technology, it could be shared, and through the social dynamics of gender. And they chose to use their own solidarity and emotional power to respond. That took a lot of discernment, right? Normally we would say, don't send any sexually explicit material, it could be shared, it's gonna ruin your career in 20 years, right? It might still, but most people have moved beyond that because there's so much out there already. They talked mostly among themselves to discern and decide on this system of practices, but what might it have looked like if a few trusted adults were part of those conversations? Maybe it wouldn't have changed what they were doing at all, but maybe it would have, right? Maybe it would have created other avenues for empowerment or other suggestions, like actually, if all of you boycott and don't send anything and you get some more people to boycott, it won't happen at all. Or maybe someone could say, you know, it's actually not the end of the world for you to really love your body and send a particular kind of photo that you're really proud of and hold them accountable for what that meant going forward to continue to love their bodies, no matter what. It did also promote healthy communication. Perhaps we don't agree with how this promoted healthy communication, but I would argue that they took into consideration the affordances and limitations, or what we would call the benefits and drawbacks of a technology system, along with the social systems, to decide what was unhealthy and what promoted their empowerment. They put their well-being first and their relationship possibilities second. And honestly, for a group of teen girls, that's actually really sophisticated. We could think of a lot of lower stake examples with this. For example, do you expect an automatic response when you text your teen, but then also tell them they should not stare at their phone 24/7? That's a mixed message about promoting healthy communication. The design of technology creates the normative practices that a text message is instant communication. There are lots of studies that show heightened anxiety around the use of those immediate kinds of forms of communication because they use behavioral techniques to raise our dopamine levels to get us to want to respond. How much are we promoting that with our own expectations of what we want young people to do when it comes to us, but not everything else in the world? So what would a value-based conversation look like to discern aspects and collectively come up with some approaches that a family could implement around when and how to respond to text messages. These kinds of conversations about current use, alternative practices, and digital discernment require major transformations in all settings of our lives. That would go for many of you in your work relationships, but also schools and families. So thinking about transformation, the girl group in that study was successful because they worked towards shared and peer-modeled behavior. They gave each other permission to set limits that weren't the norm. And they were okay when they said yes, but also when they chose not to say yes or share something. They hacked a system set up against them for their own empowerment. So those were shared and modeled behaviors. Trusted adults cannot act one way with their technology use and expect teens and young children to act a different way. You've got to practice what you preach when it comes to technology. Ask permission to post photos, model a slower pace of response, and reasonable communication times and avenues. Those are small places to start, obviously not when something's a crisis. Create spaces of permission to unplug, to rest, to be on silent. We have to work against the grain of digital intrusion, but not because it's a punishment. Remember, social media and our phones are connections to a universe of friends. They often are our avenues to responsibility when it comes to work and school. Permissive spaces can be short-lived practices. It can be dinner. It can be breakfast. It can be the car, which is probably the hardest time for everyone else sitting there to put their phones down, right? Small spaces where you all agree to it. But it could also be longer things, like a whole day on a hike or a weekend retreat. It could be spaces and times you create here for young folks. But then you also need to do it. You can't tell them they all have to put their phones in a basket as youth group and sit on your phones during worship, for example, right? You have to model what you're expecting of them. And believe me, the retreat will help you as well. So that leads us to hacking for the good. When we bring all of these practices together, especially discernment that asks, how will I bring my values to this aspect of digital life? And what shared responses can we live with as a community? We are doing what I call hacking for the good, or ethical hacking. We're gaining access to a digital ecosystem, testing for its vulnerabilities to promote values, and patching the holes by letting go of some tech, maybe choosing a different way to interact with that technology, or finding a different kind, a better tech, a new kind of tech that promotes our values. So I hope that you can see how the three postures mentioned earlier are a strong foundation for sharing information, modeling formation, and encouraging transformation for gender and sexual health and digital well-being. Just a reminder, that's accountability paired with affirmation, awareness of and respect for intergenerational support and learning, and relationships grounded in communication, presence, and honesty. And I get that all of this takes a lot of work, and we're not going to be perfect at it, but we need to be open to trial and error. And hopefully what I've provided is a scaffold for helpful postures, purposes, and processes in doing that. So thank you all, and go ahead. Sorry. Thank you. We have time for questions, and I believe if you're someone watching on the live stream, you can send in a question, and we have digital means to hear from you through reading. I don't want them to think they can speak. Okay, I'll just say something quick about sex, tech, and faith. So it is written with Christian theology in mind, given that's my background. There's a final section at the end that is just for youth. And I deal with kind of the most pressing sexuality and digital issues around online pornography, dating, online sexual violence, virtual reality, relationships and behaviors, and sex robots. And then there's a section in the back to talk to youth about all 5 of those. So.
Thank you. Would young people, this is a bad question, okay?
Okay.
Would young people really just look askance if you were to say something dumb like, whatever happened, or have you ever considered giving some candy to somebody, or flowers, or let's go out and watch a movie together as sort of a giving of a gift to indicate that you like somebody, as opposed to just through a electronic media of some kind?
So I think that's a great question to ask young people, and I think a lot of young people, some of them do that and others don't. I was actually just with someone who has a freshman and a senior in high school, and parents bemoaning the fact that the senior in high school does not do anything in her view that is nice for the girlfriend. Whereas the freshman has a new girlfriend and has taken them mini golfing, has gone out to restaurants, has bought them their favorite candy. So some of it is just who a person is, right? We all approach relationships and gifts and those kinds of things differently. But what would it look like to ask the question in a more curious kind of manner? Like, you might even say, I can't believe back in our day we used to literally write paper notes. Hand them to someone else and trust that person to give it to the person we intended. See? We did that. They read them. They probably showed someone else, right? So the idea of the digital privacy thing, there are always analog versions of it. So even starting out with a silly kind of I can't believe we did that. Tell me when you want to tell someone you like them, how would you do that? Is it through sending something digitally, or do people pass notes? Do you give someone something? They all still send a friend to check out the other person, whether that's online or in person, but the peer network is still really strong no matter what. So I think anytime I'm trying to get young people to open up and discern these practices, it always helps me to admit that my practice in the past had flaws too, and to try to get them to see some similarities, but also the differences with them. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just curious. You talked about this kind of want for intergenerational connection, and they perhaps may not have it within their own families. In your work, at what point, or is there a point, or is there an awareness that they might come to an organization like the church, a church, or any type of organization where they might? When do they start to realize the value of that, or what kind of connection would be required, or what could kind of be done to spark that, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so I heard 2 things there. I heard the question of the impact of intergenerational spaces, and that might overlap with kind of some of the service-based social justice activity. It might not. Getting kids involved in social justice service-based activities, regardless of whether it's there's always going to be some other generation helping coordinate, but even if not, that still has an impact on their health and well-being. We don't need all the research to tell us as people of faith communities that helping other people makes you feel better, right? So it for the most part, is an unconscious motivator of what we would call more ethically valuable behaviors, right, and choices. It's not a cure-all for it. What the difference is when you start talking about it. So when you actually do the work of connecting the values. So we value this, that is why we are doing X, right, activity. How did it impact you? How did you feel about that? What things did you notice in the activity that you did? So also an opportunity to break down some of the notions of privilege and social systems that are happening around them. So the action itself is great, and we already know research shows makes a significant difference. If you pair that with the why and the values behind the why, it actually has a lasting impact for continued behavior to live out those values. It doesn't, unfortunately, have a lasting value for staying in the organization, unfortunately. Now, the intergenerational piece. That piece can pair with the social justice activity and actually enhances it, especially in ways in which they gain more trusted adults in their circle, people to turn to, people who are modeling positive, healthy behavior for them. But even without it being social justice service oriented, the intergenerational piece is really just about seeing both from a sexuality perspective, that we live out our sexuality and gender from birth till death. And we focus so much on like pubescent education that it appears as that I have all my students who are, anywhere from mid-20s to 60s do a sexuality timeline. And my first, observation is always to say, when did it drop off? Because we're taught to think about sexuality only as major life events or behaviors. And so I want people to really understand that we're forming relationships, we're expressing our sexuality and gender, our bodies change and shift throughout our lifetimes. You can only see that if you are in intergenerational communities. And then if we think about the digital practices, it's also an opportunity to have younger people explain how stuff works. There can be really great opportunities where people do shared education around use of digital technology. My son, who's now a sophomore in college, was the on-call high schooler in our church for about 5 years when anyone got a new phone. Any of the older adults got a new phone. He also had his own landscaping business, so he knew them from the work that he did, but they would call up and be like, can you just come over? It says I'm supposed to scan the code and it's all gonna appear, but I don't think that's gonna happen, And he'd go over, help him out. He's not super digitally savvy. Again, they need to actually know how the tech works, and they don't spend a lot of time learning that. But can they help other people? Does it show them that communication skill? Yeah. So the last piece is really also the communication skill piece. It might be around digital technology, but learning to talk to people who are outside your family, it's a skill a lot of young people don't have. And literally just coming to church can often require you to talk to 2, 3 people maybe you're not super close with or you don't know that well. So honestly, just catching a kid in the hallway and being like, hey, I don't know your name, or maybe I do because you're wearing a name tag, but I'm just wondering, what high school do you go to? What are your hobbies? What do you, those have significant formational effects for young people because they don't get it anywhere else. So.
First of all, thank you. And that list you had of 5 or 6 things that are in your book, at the end, and I think you know which one I'm going to ask you about because what I asked you at dinner, right? Pornography. Mm-hmm. From what you know, let me start a little bit farther back. I think it's true that there's a crisis of young males in our culture. I think there is a crisis of their parents, especially their dads, if there are dads, in our culture. If you have bullying, if you have what we used to just think of as teasing as kids, but somehow it becomes vicious online. And then you also have maybe young kids' earliest introduction to how sex works, pornography. How do we get the parents into the relationship that's ideal for them to talk to the kids? And do we have to worry that pornography is actually because it kind of maybe hits some type of sensation in the brain that's temporarily pleasurable to watch? Addictive. Where do we go from here on that?
Yeah. So let me say, I didn't spend a lot of time on the whole like dopamine and behavioral science behind digital technology, because I feel like a lot of people know that already and have watched the various movies on the documentaries and whatnot. It exists, right? When you see the little light beeping on your phone, you are trained to say, I should check it. What's there for me, right? The same thing happens with any of the kind of rapid speed videos that come, right? This is why TikTok is so popular. You don't have to do anything, you just sit there and it keeps showing you new great content that's curated for you. It's the same way that online pornography has completely shifted the way people consume pornography. So let me see if I can go through a few of like key points here that are in that chapter, and I do encourage you all to read it if you're interested in it. One thing, and Owl will reinforce this, there is a significant difference between erotic material and pornography. And as an ethicist, I think that's an important thing for young people to know. There's a whole host of what we would say is sexually explicit material that maybe you want to talk to your child about when it would be okay to look at that, but that as adults, it can actually be really helpful educationally and in relationships. And that's proven from many sexologists, psychologists, all of that. So I think there is a whole set of material that fits into that category that I would say is not harmful, it's not hurting anyone, it's actually educational and relationship building when used in those ways. I do when I go to senior youth groups, if religious communities are in favor of it, I will share specific sites that have ethical pornography on it, where it's not fake, people aren't being paid, it is educational. Because honestly, they're gonna look at it anyway, and I'd rather they look at something that is real and helpful than look at something that's not. All right, that said, Pornhub is, I believe, I didn't check the numbers before I came here today, but it waffles between like the second and fourth most hit site on the internet after things like Google and Amazon. So, now this does not mean everyone's looking at it the same way everyone's looking at Google and Amazon. This is a particular, I mean, it's a large group of people, but it's some people who are clicking on it multiple times in a day, which ups their numbers. That is a site that I would categorize fully as pornography. It is not real. I have questions about the economics, even age kind of restrictions, all kinds of issues with the type of material that's there. So one, even just starting with that, like how are you making ethical choices about this material is an important conversation to have, because you should be talking about information, disinformation, and resources all the time with your kids about internet access. Talk about it when it comes to pornography too. The myth that everyone or many young boys have a potential addiction to pornography has really been debunked in about the last 10 years of some really solid research. There are 3 or 4 sort of predetermining factors for a young male who's heterosexually inclined. You know, they already have some antisocial behaviors, they experience along a mental health spectrum, issues of depression, loneliness, and they, along with sort of their own antisocial and social anxiety, they have trouble communicating across gender lines. So these are young folks who, like, you know, a female teacher would be difficult to talk to. They're not gonna talk to the the young girl who sits next to them in class. They're not gonna talk to a female at the cash register. Like, they have significant other factors that are going on. They often turn to pornography and specific types of pornography that are really, I would say, patriarchal, misogynistic, in order to empower themselves. And oftentimes they're lonely, so they spend more time online. The research shows that their frontal cortex has already got different things firing than the majority of other young adolescents. And so the rapid fire of these videos, the kind of dopamine levels of pleasure and loss, can restructure them in a way, the frontal cortex, in a way that responds the same as people who would respond to withdrawal from a kind of drug. The medical and psychology community have not agreed that there is anything considered porn addiction. I forget what the term is in the book. There's basically a euphemism, right? Like complex, inactive, something, right? Something's going on, right? But it's for a much smaller group of folks that already have these other things. So what does that say to us about this whole other swath of young people, especially young heterosexual men? Are they consuming things because no one else is talking to them and helping them understand what actual relationships look like and what it means to be in these relationships? Are they allowed to engage in certain kinds of sexual behaviors with a young woman because no one has had those conversations with young women either and helped them say, this is actually how you know your body and this is how you ask for what you want? And actually, when you both experience mutual pleasure, it's gonna be better all around? All of those factors are happening. And unless we decide we're gonna have those conversations about sexuality, about pleasure, about gender inequity, about just even how we understand gender categories, I don't think it's helpful for us to use online pornography as our worry, or for the particular group of young people for whom they have these predetermining factors. Yes, I think we should be watching out for that, especially in our schools, helping young folks around that. But for all the other average kids, they're looking for information and other stuff other places because no one's talking to them. And that's not actually that difficult to remedy. We just need to start talking to them. And we need to find positive, healthy resources for them to have. So something like doing the OWL curriculum will give them those healthy, positive other resources. But I do often point young people to, I think one youth group one time said, so this is kind of like fair trade porn? Like it's ethical? I was like, yeah, I guess, kind of. I mean, because one of the sites, the people who post there, you have to be a real person to post your material. It has to be real people in the video, and you get it's like a book writing model. You get 2 cents back every time somebody clicks on your video. So they were really savvy about it, and they cared. They actually care about the ethics of it. So anyhow, that's the highlights of the chapter around those specific issues for folks. Yeah.
I know in a lot of our churches, we have our youth and even the preteens are often in groups that are separate, and we see value in that because they're forming relationships with each other. But if you're a kind of congregation that would like to include the youth in other intergenerational activities more, and what are some of the, outside of service projects, what are some of the ones that seem to work the best, and specifically, outside of just planned projects or whatever, what are the tips or tricks for getting kids and adults who aren't their parents to know each other?
Yeah, great question. And there's lots of other creative people writing about different ways to do this. I'll name some that I know have worked. So the first and the most, where most people participate, is actually worship. is one of the hardest places to make intergenerational, because everybody, from kids to older adults, have to let go of what they expect or want out of worship, right? And so maybe you don't always do it, maybe you ease it in, but worship is a prime place for it to happen. But whenever you do this, it has to be modeled on what we know about belonging. So this is the Sharon Delos Sparks book. It has to be modeled on belonging. The idea of belonging is not just that everyone has said, oh, you're welcome to be here. We affirm you. Belonging actually means I feel invested in being part of X, and X is changed because I'm part of it. So you can't just say, well, we welcome you, come in, you can be noisy, you can do what you want. They actually have to feel like they've changed something about it and participated in it. So worship is one, and that's the hardest in faith communities to change. The second is, don't expect them to join adult things. I hate to tell you, but most of the adult things we do are boring. They don't want to join them. You should go join their things. Just participate like normal, right? It doesn't mean that they don't need their own spaces. Please don't take away their own space. Don't invade all of their own spaces, right? But, I would do, with our confirmation class, we had a whole program where folks from the congregation, they could not be related to any of the people in our confirmation class, would come in and talk about, they'd be in like small groups. All of them would talk about their faith journey. So it wasn't older adults coming and telling us what their faith journey was, but everybody was invited to share their faith journey together and learn from each other. Once you hear that about someone, every time you see them after that, you will probably say hi. So that's another kind of aspect to do it in. And then I've been part of congregations where we've done the informal, by X date, you need to meet 5 people you didn't know, or you need to find out X question about 5 people you have not talked to. And at first it becomes like everyone's like, okay, hi, so I don't think I've met you yet. Can I ask you this question? Right, but our religious education group, we decided that the kids should participate in it too. And so we did it kind of low stakes, where they had to meet 2 other kids of different age groups, and then they had to meet 1 other adult. And what we did was they actually came back and they would tell their own group about those people. So then you kind of owned that person in a way to be able to talk about it. So those are just some random ideas off the top of my head, but there's lots of other religious ed curriculum out there and things that go to it. But I would say just make it simple. Even if everyone here just commits that you're gonna talk to people, and intergenerational doesn't mean you just all have to go find a youth person to talk to. If you're in your 70s, talk to somebody in their 50s. If you're in your 50s, talk to somebody who's 80, and then maybe talk to a 30-year-old if you have them in the congregation. Right? So.
I was thinking about your comments about institutional affiliation or lack of it, and I was thinking of a young person I know who really has found a great source of influence and inspiration from podcasters. And in particular, GLBTQ-friendly podcasters, when they're not hearing that from the usual formal institutions as much as they would like and as much depth as they would like. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about influencers and podcasters that could be helpful.
Yeah, tons. And I think when I said real relationships, the reason I tried to say, I don't mean real as in real life, offline, IRL. I meant real as in the quality of them. I've done education for all of the Navy chaplains for a whole year on spirituality, religious affiliation, and digital technology. I can't tell you how many of the young people that were serving in their religious ministry teams, when they would say things like, you can't have a real relationship online with someone, that all the young people would be like, I have all kinds of friends I've never met in real life, right? Especially young people who are traveling all over the world and don't get to build those relationships in other ways. So I think the first step that your story should remind us all is that these are real quality relationships. That young person sees those podcasters as a trusted adult. And honestly, that person is, because they are showing up in a way that supports the well-being of that young person. Now, that can go the other way, right? It could be an adult who's not a great role model that they latch onto. But what it's telling us is they're looking for those folks. And if we can offer them some suggestions, some great LGBTQ inclusive podcasts to listen to, if that's what they need at that moment, or I've recently been working a lot on the questions of sort of white masculinity and gender and pornography, and so I've been looking at a lot of groups who, like A Call to Men, who this is not your like return to patriarchy kind of group. This is like positive masculinity, how to support young men finding themselves in positive ways that honor themselves and all the genders of people around them. So I think having those resources, thinking about them, but also just recognizing that those are important and valuable things. So I think too many times we say to young people, like, ugh, get offline, or just close that down. And that's okay sometimes. But what I'd rather we say is, like, what are you doing online right now? Who are you connecting to? Why are your earbuds in? What are you listening to? Right? Instead of take them out or put that down or I'm taking it away. Because none of that creates a connection and none of it allows us to hear what they're looking for, so that we could possibly go and do our own research and maybe come back and be like, hey, I saw this thing, maybe you're interested in it. I mean, my son's in business school now, which is not of interest to me, but he really loves organizational management, so I started following all these organizational management people online so that I can send him stuff and be like, hey, have you heard of this? Do you like this? Right? It's what we do when we love people. We find connections to things that interest them. So, thank you for offering that as an example. Sorry to all the business people out there. Organizational management is actually way more interesting than I thought. I will admit that. Way more interesting than I thought. Yeah, they need to hear you on the last.
No, I was just going to say, if there are no more questions, I want to thank all of you who came out tonight and those streaming online as well. Thank you, Kate, for joining us, and a good evening to all. Thank you.